The blood was still warm when the last breath escaped from the rouge-painted lips. Anne of Joyeuse, the most handsome of Henry III's cherished favorites, lay on the cold marble floor of the Louvre Palace, his golden hair spread like a profaned halo, while the echo of blades still reverberated through the shadowy corridors of the French court. It was October 20th, 1587, and death had arrived not through honor in battle, but by the trembling hands of men consumed by a jealousy so visceral that it had turned the most refined court in Europe into a silent slaughterhouse. But to understand the horrific brutality of that moment, one must go back in time to when the Mignons reigned like mortal gods in the gilded halls of Versailles, and when the very King of France whispered state secrets into the perfumed ears of young men so beautiful they seemed sculpted by fallen angels. It was an era when power manifested not only through sword and crown, but through seduction, beauty, and an intimacy as dangerous as the conspiracies simmering in the shadows of the French monarchy. Henry III had ascended to the throne in 1574 as a 23-year-old prince with almond-shaped eyes that gleamed with keen intelligence and a sensuality that scandalized even the most libertine court in Europe. Unlike his predecessors, who ruled through brute force and calculated marital alliances, Henry discovered that male beauty could be a political weapon as lethal as any army. His mignons, an archaic French term meaning cherished favorites, were not merely companions. They were extensions of his will, his invisible hands reaching into the realm's most secret corners. Anne of Joyeuse stood out among them all as an almost supernatural creature. At 17, when he first arrived at court, his face possessed a disturbing androgyny that made duchesses sigh silently, and cardinals avert their eyes with a guilt that gnawed at them from within. His hair, naturally golden as wheat, ripening under the August sun, fell in silky waves to his shoulders, framing features so delicate they seemed chiseled by Michelangelo in his most divinely inspired moments. Yet it was his eyes, of a blue, as deep as the Mediterranean Sea at dusk, that captured souls and ensnared them in a web of fascination and terror. The king discovered him during a hunt in the woods of Fontainebleau, when Anne, then merely a young provincial nobleman, appeared riding a black horse with a natural elegance that made the most seasoned courtiers seem rustic peasants. Henry III, who until then had resisted countless suitors' charms, felt something stir in his chest, a hunger that was not only carnal but political, a need to possess not just the body of that youth, but his soul, his loyalty, his very existence. That very night, in the king's private chambers lit only by beeswax candles casting dancing shadows on golden silk walls, Henry whispered in Anne's ear words that sealed both their fates. "You will be my mirror, my voice when I cannot speak, my eyes when I cannot see. In return, I will give you a power that entire kingdoms will envy." Thus was born a relationship that transcended the boundaries between love, politics, and obsession, an intensity so fierce it would turn the French court into a pressure cooker ready to explode. During the first 2 years of his reign over the king's heart, Anne lived like a crownless prince. He received lands, titles, and riches that made century-old dukes grind their teeth in envy. His influence grew daily like a poisonous vine, feeding on palace whispers and intrigues. Foreign ambassadors arriving in Paris knew that to secure a royal audience with Henry III, they first had to win the favor of his golden mignon. Anne had become the filter through which all royal power flowed, and he wielded that position with ruthless skill. However, what disturbed the French nobility most was not merely Anne's political influence, but the intimate, almost conjugal nature of his relationship with the king. They were seen at all hours together. At morning mass, when Henry III insisted that Anne kneel beside him at the royal prie-dieu, at evening banquets where the king personally served the finest dishes to his favorite, and particularly during the long winter nights, when the doors of the royal apartments remained locked and only furtive whispers echoed through thick stone walls. Pierre de l'Estoile, a prominent chronicler of the era, wrote in his secret journal, "The king loves this young man with a passion that surpasses reason and decency. I have seen His Majesty kiss Anne's hands in public, caress his hair during audiences, and whisper words into his ear that make the young man blush like a maiden. God forgive us, but I fear France has two kings, and the more handsome of the two has not a drop of royal blood." These words, penned by trembling candlelight, revealed the growing discomfort that began to consume not only the court, but the entire French aristocracy. Anne's physical transformation during those years of ascendancy was nothing short of spectacular and disturbing. The young Joyeuse peasant had vanished completely, replaced by a creature of almost artificial beauty. His hair, now maintained by a perfumer imported expressly from Florence, glimmered with exotic oils that cost more than an artisan's annual wage. His naturally fair skin was now polished alabaster, the result of daily baths in goat's milk infused with rose and lavender essences. But it was his attire that scandalized onlookers most. Oriental silks in shades of sky blue and gold, embroidered with silver threads and adorned with pearls from the Orient, costing fortunes that left even European queens feeling modest in comparison. Yet behind the veneer of luxury and beauty, Anne of Joyeuse had cultivated a political acumen as sharp as any blade. He understood that his position depended not only on keeping the king enamored, but on making himself indispensable to the realm's administration. Gradually, Anne began placing his own men in key positions within the royal bureaucracy. His brothers received important military commands. His cousins were appointed to crucial diplomatic posts, and a silent network of loyalty coalesced around him. It was during private audiences in a secret chamber adjacent to the royal apartments that Anne truly exercised his power. Disfavored nobles discovered that a word whispered by Anne in the king's ear could restore their fortunes. Merchants seeking trade privileges learned that valuable gifts discreetly left in the mignons' quarters proved more effective than official petitions. Foreign envoys recognized that Anne of Joyeuse had become not merely the king's favorite, but the true conduit through which royal will manifested. But power, Anne would soon realize, is a corrosive substance that both elevates and destroys. With every favor granted, every influence exerted, every whisper exchanged with the king, Anne forged not only allies but mortal enemies. The venerable French nobility, having served the crown for centuries, began to see in this provincial youth an existential threat to the established order. How could a lad without lineage, without hereditary titles, and without noble blood wield more influence than dukes whose families trace their origins to the Crusades? The Duke of Guise, leader of the Catholic League, and a man whose ambition rivaled only his cruelty, was first to articulate what many whispered but dared not speak. During a secret gathering at his Champagne estate in the winter of 1585, Guise convened the principal opponents of Henry III's regime. The meeting, illuminated solely by torches casting sinister shadows on bare stone walls, had one objective: to discuss how to neutralize the mignons' influence, particularly that of Anne of Joyeuse. "Gentlemen," Guise intoned, his low, menacing voice echoing in the frigid chamber, "France is being governed by sodomites and libertines. The king has lost his reason, blinded by the beauty of boys who should be serving in the stables, not dictating royal policy. This Anne of Joyeuse is more dangerous than any enemy army, for he corrupts the very heart of the realm." His words fell upon those present like venomous seeds that would soon germinate into bloody conspiracies. Yet Anne was no fool. Through his own network of spies, young lesser nobles strategically placed in various aristocratic households, he learned that moves against him were underway. What disturbed him most were not merely external threats, but the growing emotional instability of the king himself. Henry III, who at the start of his reign had displayed a passionate yet controlled ardor, began exhibiting signs of a love verging on pathological obsession. The king started following Anne throughout the palace, unable to bear more than a few hours apart from his favorite. At mealtimes, Henry III insisted that Anne sit not only to his right, but so close that their legs touched beneath the table. By night, the king demanded that Anne remain in his apartments until he fell asleep, and often roused him in the dead of night, merely to confirm that the young man was still within the palace walls. This escalating emotional dependence began to terrify Anne, who realized he had become a gilded prisoner of the very power that had elevated him. The Jesuit priest Edmund Auger, Henry III's royal confessor, left behind disturbing records of the king's mental state during this period. His Majesty confesses to me sins I dare not inscribe in these pages. His obsession with this youth has transcended reason and faith. He speaks of Anne as mystics speak of God, with a devotion that is both sublime and blasphemous. I fear for our king's soul, but more yet, do I fear for France's fate in the hands of a monarch who can no longer distinguish between love and madness. Tensions only heightened when other Mignons realized that Anne's position was not merely privileged, but virtually untouchable. Épernon, D'Arc, and Maugiron, the remaining royal favorites, found that no matter how seductive they were, how clever they proved themselves, or how useful they became, they could never supplant the special place Anne held in the king's affections. This realization bred internecine jealousy among the Mignons themselves, a venom as deadly as the hostility from traditional nobility. Jean-Louis de Nogaret de la Valette, Duke of Épernon, burned with a jealousy that corroded his soul like acid. At 25, he possessed a dark, masculine beauty that stood in stark contrast to Anne's ethereal androgyny. Épernon had arrived at court 2 years prior to Anne, and for a brief time had enjoyed the status of primary favorite. Anne's arrival did not merely end his ascendancy, but relegated him to a secondary role he deemed intolerable. During a private audience in March 1586, Épernon made a desperate bid to reclaim his position. Through careful espionage, he discovered that Anne maintained secret correspondence with Spanish agents, not out of treason, but as part of a sophisticated intelligence network, aiding him in anticipating international political moves. Épernon presented these letters to the king as proof that Anne was a traitor, allied with Philip II of Spain. Henry III's reaction was explosive and revealing. Instead of investigating the accusations or confronting Anne directly, the king erupted in fury, sending palace servants fleeing to hidden corners. Grabbing Épernon by the hair, he shouted, "How dare you slander the one more precious to me than my own life? These letters show only that Anne is clever enough to protect my interests better than any of you." Then, in a gesture that shocked even courtiers accustomed to royal excess, Henry III slapped Épernon so fiercely that the young duke collapsed, his face marked by royal rings. Épernon's public humiliation marked a point of no return among the Mignons. What had been rivalry became mortal hatred. Épernon, still reeling from the king's strike, vowed silently to make Anne pay for his disgrace, not merely by removing him as favorite, but by destroying him utterly. He was not alone in this thirst for vengeance. Maugiron and D'Arques, realizing that their survival at court depended on Anne's downfall, secretly allied themselves with Épernon. They forged a conspiracy within a conspiracy, a nucleus of hatred at the very heart of the royal circle. In nightly meetings at Épernon's apartments, lit by a single flickering candle, they plotted not only Anne's political demise, but his physical destruction. Meanwhile, Anne of Joyeuse lived under constant vigilance that eroded both his appearance and his mental health. His golden hair, once shining like polished gold, lost its luster. His alabaster complexion turned sickly pale from sleepless nights, spent straining to hear any sound in the corridors, interpreting every whisper as a potential threat. His blue eyes, once bright and confident, grew feverish, darting constantly as if those of a cornered animal. Seeing his favorite's mounting anxiety, the king sought to protect Anne by amplifying his privileges. He assigned personal guards. To the young man, installed him in apartments even closer to the king's own, and forbade Anne from leaving the palace unescorted. Yet these measures, rather than reassure Anne, only confirmed his worst fears. He had become not merely a target, but a gilded prisoner whose only safeguard was the proximity of a king clearly losing his sanity. The first real attempt on Anne's life came in July 1586, during a feast held in honor of the Venetian ambassador. The banquet took place in the Louvre's Grand Hall, illuminated by hundreds of silver candelabras, whose hundreds of candles made guests' jewels sparkle like stars. Anne, seated to the king's right as always, had just brought a piece of roast pheasant to his lips when he detected an unusual bitterness. His courtly experience had taught him to trust his instincts. Something about the taste alerted him to mortal peril. Discreetly, Anne spat the morsel into his silk handkerchief, feigning to wipe his lips, and murmured to the king, "Your Majesty, I believe my food has been poisoned." Without a moment's hesitation, Henry III leapt from his seat and ordered that no one else touch the feast. The royal physicians were summoned post-haste, and subsequent analyses confirmed that Anne's dish had indeed been laced with enough arsenic to kill him within minutes. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal. Under torture, one of the cooks confessed to being bribed by a hooded man who had promised him a fortune in exchange for poisoning Anne. The cook was publicly executed, but the true mastermind was never unmasked. Nevertheless, Anne had no doubt about who had orchestrated the attempt. His fellow mignons had crossed the line from rivalry to attempted murder. This episode ushered in a silent, deadly war within the palace's most intimate chambers. Now, certain his life was in constant jeopardy, Anne began taking his own defensive measures. He discreetly enlisted some of the royal guard's most loyal soldiers, offering generous rewards for covert protection. More importantly, Anne started to document every conspiracy he uncovered, compiling a secret archive that could serve as evidence should anything befall him. Yet paranoia proved contagious, sweeping through the court like a plague. The king, already emotionally unsteady, grew even more possessive and jealous. Henry III began to interpret any conversation between Anne and other courtiers as potential betrayal. Any extended absence of his favorite as abandonment, any sign of fatigue or worry in Anne as evidence that he was being courted by enemies. Their relationship, once passion born of mutual desire, had evolved into a form of shared madness. In the winter of 1586, tensions escalated further with the arrival of Mary of Montpensier at court. The young Duchess, sister of the Duke of Guise, was a woman of extraordinary beauty and shrewd political intellect. At 22, her chestnut hair gleamed with copper highlights in candlelight, and her green eyes seemed to pierce souls. Her natural poise made even Anne appear contrived. But beyond her beauty, Mary carried a secret mission: to seduce and destroy the man who posed the greatest obstacle to her family's political ambitions. Mary presented herself at court as simultaneously enthralling and perilous. She wielded the rare talent of being both seductive and respectable, able to debate theology with cardinals by day and whisper erotic insinuations to young courtiers by night. Her strategy concerning Anne was particularly cunning. Rather than attacking him outright or vying for his position, she posed as a sympathetic confidant, someone who understood the unique pressures of being the king's favorite. Their first conversations took place during Sunday Mass at the Royal Chapel. Mary positioned herself so Anne could not help but notice her, yet she never approached him directly. Instead, she allowed Anne to initiate contact, intrigued by a woman who showed neither envy nor romantic interest in him. Finally, during a reception in January 1587, Anne discovered in Mary an intelligence that rivaled his own and an understanding of court politics few possessed. "Lord of Joyeuse," she said at their first private conversation in a discreet alcove of the palace's winter gardens, "I admire how you maintain your position amid such peril. It must be terribly lonely to be so beloved by the king and so reviled by everyone else." Her tone of sincere compassion struck a raw nerve in Anne's soul. For the first time in years, he found someone who seemed to truly comprehend his plight. What Anne did not realize was that every word Mary uttered had been meticulously planned. She had studied her target with the dedication of a general readying for battle. Mary knew Anne's deepest emotional vulnerabilities, his darkest fears, and how to exploit his burgeoning loneliness as a weapon. Through seemingly chance encounters and conversations that appeared spontaneous, Mary planted seeds of doubt in Anne's mind about his relationship with the king. "Have you ever wondered," she whispered during a stroll in the gardens in March 1587, "what will happen when the king tires of you, or when he dies? You have no family of your own, no heirs, no lands not dependent on royal generosity. Your position stands on quicksand, and quicksand always sinks." These words, like poisoned seeds, took root in Anne's mind, nurturing anxieties he desperately tried to stifle. Yet Mary's manipulation extended beyond emotional deceit. She gathered invaluable intelligence on palace routines, guard schedules, the personal habits of the royal favorite, and especially the security lapses protecting Anne. Each detail she unearthed was relayed with precision to her brother, the Duke of Guise, who was orchestrating a plot far more ambitious than merely ousting Anne from court. Guise had grasped that Anne of Joyeuse was not merely a political obstacle, but the embodiment of all that was flawed in Henry III's reign. Anne's assassination would be a symbolic declaration. It would expose the king's vulnerability and underscore the moral collapse of his government. More critically, the demise of the royal favorite could serve as the pretext Guise needed to raise open rebellion against the throne. In a clandestine meeting in April 1587 at a safe house in Paris, Guise unveiled his final plan to the conspirators. "Gentlemen, the time has come to purge France of this moral plague that infects us. Anne of Joyeuse must die, but his death must be public, brutal, and symbolic. He must perish in a manner that degrades not only him, but the king who shields him. And this death must be framed as the result of a quarrel among the Mignons themselves, so that no one can trace it back to us." The plan's diabolism lay in its simplicity. Épernon would be provoked publicly by Guise's agents until he challenged Anne to a duel. The duel would appear fair, yet Anne would be forced to fight with a sword purposely weakened, so it would shatter at a critical moment, leaving him defenseless before Épernon. Though the outcome would technically appear as an honorable knightly duel, it was in truth a meticulously orchestrated murder. But for the scheme to work, Anne needed to be goaded into accepting the duel, requiring a provocation so severe he could not refuse without forsaking his honor. This is where Mary of Montpensier's role became pivotal. In an especially intimate conversation in May 1587, she planted the seed that would blossom into final tragedy. "Anne," she said, her hand brushing his as they walked through the palace's private gardens, "I discovered something that I must share with you, though I know it will wound you deeply." She then recounted a carefully fabricated tale of how she had caught Épernon conspiring with other courtiers, detailing in graphic and humiliating terms the supposed physical intimacy between Anne and the king. According to Mary, Épernon not only ridiculed Anne as a refined courtesan, but had publicly vowed to prove the royal favourite's cowardice by forcing him into a duel he could not dare accept. Anne's response was precisely what Mary anticipated. His blue eyes blazed with a cold, deadly rage. His hands quivered with an anger he rarely felt, and for the first time in months, all his dread and turmoil were replaced by a fervent thirst for vengeance. "That bastard," he hissed, voice low and ominous, "will learn what kind of man I truly am." That very night, Anne sought out Epanon in his chambers. Their confrontation was brief but seething with intensity. Anne, exuding a frosty dignity that made his eyes glint like diamonds, demanded satisfaction for Epanon's slanders. Epanon, prepared for this moment, accepted the challenge, barely concealing his glee. The duel was scheduled for dawn. On October 20th, 1587, in a secluded corner of the royal gardens, away from prying eyes, yet witnessed by enough onlookers to ensure the result was widely known. The final 2 weeks of Anne of Joyeuse's life unfolded in a surreal calm, starkly contrasting the preceding month's tension. He seemed to embrace a serene acceptance that astonished even the king. Henry III, who had vehemently opposed the duel upon learning of it, found he could not sway Anne. The royal favourite had at last discovered something more precious than his own safety, his honour. During those last weeks, Anne spent long hours composing letters he never intended to send, meditated in the royal chapel during the still hours before dawn, and arranged his affairs with meticulous care that presaged his fate. He made a will, bequeathing his possessions to charitable institutions, penned letters of forgiveness to those he deemed adversaries, and spent his final nights in his own quarters, alone with his thoughts and preparations. Dawn on October 20th, 1587, arrived cold and overcast, a dense fog draping the Louvre gardens like a funeral shroud. Anne rose before sunrise, dressed with careful precision, opting for simple yet elegant attire that would not hinder his movements, and spent the final hour before the duel on his knees in prayer at his private chapel. His golden hair, casually swept back, shimmered in votive candlelight, and his face bore a near holy serenity that belied the months of dread that had preceded. When Anne emerged to walk toward the duel site, he found the king waiting for him in the corridor. Henry III was in visible torment, his eyes red from weeping, hands trembling uncontrollably, and voice cracking as he implored one last time, "Anne, my dearest Anne, do not do this. I forbid the duel. I am your king, and I command you not to go." Yet Anne, displaying a tender grace that broke every heart present, kissed the king's hands and replied, "Your Majesty, you have given me everything: power, wealth, love. Now grant me the last thing I need, the right to die with honor." The duel's venue was a small circular meadow encircled by stately trees, tucked away in the most secluded portion of the royal gardens. A mist still clung to the grass when Anne arrived, accompanied only by his second and a physician. Epanon was already there, practicing precise sword strokes that exuded an arrogance polished by months of plotting. Concealed among the shadows of the trees were silent observers, courtiers who came to witness the event, Guise's agents disguised as palace servants, and Mary of Montpensier, concealed behind a curtain of low branches, her green eyes fixed on the man she had lured to his demise. Swords were examined by the seconds under strict protocol. Epanon's rapier was a superior Italian blade, flexible and ornate, its guard gleaming even in the muted dawn light. Anne's appeared identical in quality, a Parisian goldsmith's work with an engraved silver hilt and a blade seemingly flawless. Yet unbeknownst to all but the conspirators, Anne's sword had been tampered with the night before. A microscopic fracture had been introduced at the base of the blade. imperceptible to the untrained eye, but destined to snap under the pressure of a prolonged duel. When sunlight finally pierced the mist, casting golden shafts through the foliage, the duel commenced. Anne and Eponon positioned themselves 10 paces apart, their blades gleaming like lethal shards of ice. The hush was absolute. No bird dared sing in that moment of mortal tension. At the chief's second signal, the two advanced, their movements graceful and lethal like predators closing in on prey. The opening minutes revealed both combatants' exceptional skill. Anne, despite his delicate appearance, displayed a fencing style that astonished even Eponon. His footwork was fluid as dance, his strikes precise as surgery, every movement tinged with deadly elegance that turned the clash into a perverse form of artistry. Eponon, for his part, fought with calculated aggression born of rigorous military training, each blow designed to maim and humiliate. Sparks flew as their blades met with ferocious force, prompting onlookers to recoil instinctively. Anne's first cut opened a shallow gash on Eponon's left arm, letting a crimson line bloom down the white sleeve of the young duke. Eponon countered with a thrust so close to Anne's neck that it severed strands of his golden hair, which drifted to the grass like fallen petals. Yet as the duel wore on, the conspirators' sabotage took its toll. Anne's sword began to emit a faint metallic groan with each clash, a subtle but ominous sign of imminent failure. Immersed in the fight, Anne did not at once perceive the danger. He pressed his attacks more fiercely, driven by determination. Upon realizing Eponon proved a far more formidable opponent than he had anticipated. During a fierce exchange of attacks and parries, tragedy struck. Anne had maneuvered Eponon onto the defensive with a brilliant flurry of thrusts, forcing his rival to retreat several paces. Spotting an opening, Anne lunged for the decisive blow. An impeccable thrust aimed at victory, but at the precise moment his blade met Eponon's guard, the sabotage revealed its cruel purpose. Anne's sword snapped with a sound like a metallic scream. The shattered blade flew high, leaving him clutching only a jagged hilt. For an eternity of heartbeats, Anne stood frozen, staring at the weapon's remnants with absolute shock. In that instant, he understood he had been betrayed, not merely by Eponon, but by an entire conspiracy meticulously orchestrating his downfall. Eponon, momentarily startled by the unexpected fracture, seized the opening fate granted him. He lunged for the killing blow, his rapier aimed precisely at Anne's heart. Yet Anne, unarmed and betrayed, would not surrender meekly. In a move that stunned all present, Anne dropped the broken sword and seized Eponon's blade with his bare hands. The steel tore into his palms, blood spurting between his fingers, yet he managed to deflect the fatal strike long enough to attempt one final defense. Blood oozing down his arms, Anne wrestled with the rapier, his fingers slipping on the slick steel as he sought to seize the weapon from his assailant. What followed was a desperate, brutal struggle devoid of any aristocratic elegance. Anne and Eponon collapsed onto the damp grass, their bodies locked in a savage dance as they fought over sole possession of the remaining sword. Anne's lifeblood stained the green blades of grass, forming a grotesque tapestry against the tranquil morning light. His agonized groans intermingled with Eponon's primal grunts, producing a symphony of torment that drove many watchers to cover their ears. But blood loss and betrayal's shock took their toll. Anne felt his strength ebbing by the second, his vision blurring as the world slipped into an otherworldly haze. Eponon, detecting his foe's weakening grip, regained control of the sword and positioned it for the final strike. The first blow drove into Anne's abdomen, slicing deep into his entrails with a horrifying wet crack that caused several onlookers to retch and scream. A sound partway between mortal agony and spiritual anguish echoed through the gardens like a lament for a soul torn from its vessel. Yet Eponon was not done. Months of humiliation and envy had hardened into a thirst for vengeance that demanded prolonged torment. The second thrust pierced Anne's chest, collapsing a lung and sending frothy blood pooling at his lips. His bright blue eyes, once so clear and confident, began to glaze as life drained slowly from his body. Still, he struggled to speak, his words emerging as blood-stained whispers only Epanon heard. I forgive you. This final, magnanimous utterance fueled Epanon's fury further. He perceived Anne's mercy as moral superiority that must be obliterated. The third and final stroke was the cruelest. Epanon turned his blade and drove it slowly into Anne's heart, twisting deliberately to maximize agony. Anne convulsed, his back arching in a final tortured spasm, his fingers curling in a last, visceral struggle against death's approach. His golden hair, now matted with blood, spread around his head like a profaned halo, symbolizing an angel's fall. Even in his final moments, Anne of Joyeuse retained a dignity that impressed even his killers. Summoning his last breath, he lifted his gaze to the morning sky and uttered a prayer only God and the heavenly host could fully comprehend. Then, with a sigh that carried the sum of the world's beauty and sorrow, Anne of Joyeuse died. His blue eyes fixed on a distant point where mortal men cannot tread. The silence that followed Anne's death was absolute and haunting. Epanon, still standing over his victim, seemed to age 10 years in mere minutes. The rage that had sustained him through the struggle evaporated, leaving only an abyssal emptiness and the dawning understanding of what he had wrought. Around the meadow, spectators slipped away in muted shock, each carrying the memory of a scene that would haunt them forever. Mary of Montpensier was among the first to depart. She had achieved her brother's command, the assassination of the royal favorite, but the emotional toll far exceeded her expectations. Witnessing Anne's agony, seeing the nobility with which he faced betrayal and death, awoke in her a guilt she never anticipated. As she hurried back to the palace, Mary could not stop replaying Anne's final words, "I forgive you," and how those simple words revealed a greatness of spirit that made her victory bitter as gall. Within the hour, the news of Anne's demise reached Henry III. The king, seated in his private apartment, struggling to concentrate on state documents, was informed by the royal guard captain, whose face was ashen. "Your Majesty," he stammered, "terrible news, Lord of Joyeuse. He is dead." Henry III's response was instantaneous and devastating. He collapsed as if physically struck, his knees buckling and body slumping into the royal seat. For interminable minutes, he remained speechless, staring into empty air while silent tears streamed down his cheeks. When he regained the power to speak, it came as a guttural wail, so raw and anguished that servants present wept in sympathy. "Bring him to me," Henry III finally whispered. "Bring my Anne to me, now." Thus began an impromptu funeral, procession that resembled a royal pageant more than a mere corpse transfer. Anne of Joyeuse's body was carried through the Louvre gardens to the king's private chambers. Henry insisted on receiving the body himself. Upon seeing Anne's mutilated, blood-soaked yet still tragically beautiful visage, the king let out a mournful cry that reverberated through the palace. What followed was 3 days and nights of royal mourning that stunned even a court accustomed to its monarch's emotional extremes. Henry III refused to allow traditional funeral services to handle Anne's remains. Instead, he personally washed the body, combed his golden hair, dressed him in the finest garments, and placed him in an improvised catafalque within his own apartments. For 3 days, the king neither ate nor slept and received no guests, remaining by Anne's side, clutching his cold hand and whispering words of love and remorse that none but the departed could hear. Pierre de l'Estoile, ever the chronicler of the palace's macabre details, noted in his diary, "The king has lost his reason entirely. He speaks to the deceased as though he were alive, kisses his cold lips, and vows vengeance on all who conspired in this tragedy." I fear France has lost not just a royal favorite, but the king himself, for Henry III died alongside Anne of Joyeuse. What remains is but an empty shell propelled by grief and vengeance. Indeed, Anne's death marked the beginning of the end for Henry III. The ruler, who had once combined political acumen with personal indulgence, transformed into a dark figure consumed by a quest for revenge. Epernon was immediately banished from court under penalty of death, yet even that failed to quench Henry's thirst for retribution. The king launched an obsessive investigation to identify every conspirator in Anne's assassination. And slowly, the truth of Guy's and Mary of Montpensier's involvement began to emerge. Royal vengeance, when it finally arrived, was as brutal as the crime. Mary of Montpensier was found dead in her chambers 3 months later, the victim of a poison that caused her to suffer for hours before succumbing. Her final words, according to a maid present, were, Anne, forgive me. I see you forgiving me." The Duke of Guise attempted to flee Paris, but was captured by royal agents and publicly executed in a ceremony lasting hours, a death as prolonged and agonizing as the king's torturers could devise. Yet even after exacting vengeance, Henry III never recovered from Anne's loss. He continued to rule France for 2 more years, but he was a ghost of a monarch, a man whose soul had departed with his favorite on that blood-soaked morning in August 1589, almost exactly 2 years after Anne's death. Henry III was assassinated by Jacques Clément, a fanatical monk who murdered him during an audience. The king's last words, according to witnesses, were, "Anne, finally, Anne." Anne of Joyeuse's body was interred in a clandestine ceremony within a private chapel of the palace, yet his tomb became a pilgrimage site for a select courtly elite who regarded him not merely as a martyred favorite, but as the symbol of an era now past. Letters discovered decades later revealed that Anne had foreseen his demise, writing to a distant cousin, "I know my days are numbered. The power I have acquired is built on envy and hatred, and those sentiments always find a way to surface. Yet I regret nothing. I have lived intensely, loved deeply, and will die with honor. What more can a man ask?" The saga of Anne of Joyeuse and Henry III's minions became a grim legend haunting the French court for generations. It served as a cautionary tale about the perils of excessive royal favoritism, the fragility of power reliant on personal whim, and how beauty and intelligence, when unchecked by prudence, can sow the seeds of ruin. But perhaps the deepest lesson of Anne's tragedy lies in human nature itself, how love may morph into obsession, how jealousy may blossom into murderous hatred, and how even the most extraordinary among us remain subject to the same destructive passions that govern all mortals. In the aftermath of Anne's death and the Valois dynasty's collapse, historians and chroniclers strove to decipher what truly transpired in those mist-shrouded Louvre gardens on that fateful October morning. Some saw the episode as a necessary purification, eliminating a corrupting influence, undermining royal authority. Others interpreted it as the cowardly assassination of a young man whose lone crime was being loved too fiercely by his king. Yet, perhaps reality defies any singular political or moral interpretation, for it is far more complex and inherently human. Anne of Joyeuse was, above all, a product of his time, an age when male beauty could confer power, when personal intimacy with the monarch could sway nations' destinies, and when powerful private passions wrought devastating public consequences. He lived in a court where love and politics were indistinguishable, where survival hinged upon navigating fragile alliances and mortal enmities, and where a single smile could outweigh an army's might. Yet Anne was also victim to forces transcending his era: mortal enmity toward those seemingly graced by the divine, resentment harbored by mediocrity for brilliance, and the human impulse to destroy what they cannot possess or comprehend. His extraordinary beauty, intended as his greatest blessing, became his curse. His political acumen, expected to ensure his survival, intensified his enemy's hatred, and his genuine love for the king, supposed to shield him, became the source of his vulnerability. Anne of Joyeus's death in that sabotage duel on a cold October morning in 1587 signified more than a single life's end. It marked the conclusion of an era and the closing of a chapter in French history that would never be repeated. With his passing died also the notion that power might legitimately derive from beauty and affection. Subsequent monarchs learned to keep personal favorites distinct from political advisors, lest the heart govern the state directly, a peril they dared never repeat. Yet perhaps the most tragic facet of Anne's story is that his death was, in the end, unnecessary. He perished not because he posed a genuine threat to the kingdom, but because he symbolized a mode of power his adversaries refused to accept. He died not for corruption or incompetence, but for being different, defying traditional expectations of how and by whom power should be wielded. His tragedy lay in being a man of the future, living in a time still shackled to the past, a soul whose vision spanned centuries beyond his own age. And so, when that final breath slipped from Anne of Joyeus's lips on that ominous morning, another world died with him. Not merely the life of an extraordinary man, but an unrealized possibility. That power might flow through seduction rather than force, through beauty rather than brutality, through love rather than fear. France would never again witness a court like the Mignon's era. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. Not only that Anne died, but that with him perished a more humane, more beautiful way to wield power.